The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital corridor hummed their eternal, indifferent song as Richard Morrison stood frozen outside room 347, his Italian leather shoes silent against the polished floor. Inside that room lay his father, Thomas Morrison, a man who had once stood 6'2", with shoulders that carried the weight of their family's dreams, now reduced to a frail figure drowning in white sheets and morphine dreams. Richard's reflection stared back at him from the darkened window across the hall. A man worth $43 million, who would have traded every cent to erase the agony etched into his father's face. But money, he was learning, couldn't buy everything. Some prices were paid in different currency altogether. Thomas Morrison had been a steelworker for 42 years, his hands calloused monuments to honest labor, his back bent from decades of 12-hour shifts at the Pittsburgh mill. He'd never complained, not even when the accident 3 years ago had shattered his spine and sentenced him to a life of unrelenting pain. The insurance settlement had been modest, barely enough to cover the mounting medical bills. Richard had begged him to accept more help, to move into the guest house on his estate where round-the-clock nurses could attend to him. But Thomas was proud, perhaps too proud, insisting on staying in the modest, two-bedroom house he'd shared with Richard's stepmother, Elena, for the past 15 years. Elena had entered their lives when Richard was already grown, already building his tech empire in Silicon Valley. His mother had passed when he was 19, and after 5 years of grief-stricken solitude, Thomas had met Elena at a church community dinner. She was a quiet woman from Guatemala, her English hesitant but her smile radiant. Richard had been skeptical at first, perhaps even suspicious of her motives. His father wasn't wealthy, but everyone knew Richard had money. Lots of it. The wedding had been simple, and Richard had attended with a forced smile and a guarded heart. Over the years, that guard had never fully dropped. Elena remained an enigma to him, pleasant enough during his visits, but reserved, always keeping a respectful distance. She never asked him for anything, never hinted at wanting a piece of his fortune. If anything, she seemed almost uncomfortable around wealth, declining his offers to vacation with them, to accept gifts, to upgrade their life. Richard told himself it was humility, but a nagging voice wondered if it was something else, something calculated. Now, watching his father suffer, those old suspicions had begun to fester. Thomas needed experimental treatments, specialized care that his basic insurance wouldn't cover. Richard had offered repeatedly to pay for everything, the surgeries, the medications, the therapies that might give his father relief. But Thomas refused every time, and Richard suspected he knew why. Elena must be discouraging it, he thought. Perhaps she was worried that if Thomas accepted too much help, there would be less inheritance for her when the old man finally succumbed to his pain. The thought made Richard's blood simmer with quiet rage. His father was suffering, truly suffering, and what was she doing? The few times Richard visited, Eleanor would slip away, murmuring about errands or appointments. She was rarely home anymore. According to the neighbors, Richard had quietly questioned, where was she going? What was she doing while his father lay in agony? It was Mrs. Chen from next door who finally planted the seed that grew into full-blown suspicion. Your stepmother keeps such strange hours now. She'd mentioned casually during one of Richard's visits. Gone before dawn some days, coming home late at night. At her age, you'd think she'd want to rest more, especially with your father so ill. That night, Richard sat in his hotel room overlooking the city, the skyline glittering with 1,000 lights that felt cold as ice. He thought about his father's labored breathing, the way Thomas would grip the bedsheets until his knuckles turned white, trying not to cry out. He thought about Elena's absences, her evasiveness, her refusal to encourage Thomas to accept help. The decision came to him with crystal clarity. He would find out what Elena was really doing. He owed his father that much. The private investigator came recommended from Richard's corporate attorney, discreet, professional, thorough. Within 3 days, Richard had a folder on his desk containing photographs, time-stamped records, and a detailed report. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. expecting to find evidence of an affair or secret gambling debts, or some scheme to drain what little savings his father had left. What he found instead made him stop breathing altogether. The photographs showed Elena, but not the Elena he thought he knew. There she was at 5:30 a.m., entering the back door of a commercial laundry facility. Another photo showed her at a different location, wearing a hairnet and apron, working at what appeared to be a food processing plant. A third captured her pushing a cleaning cart through an office building lobby, the timestamp reading 11:47 p.m. Richard's investigator had been thorough. Elena was working 3 jobs, sometimes 4 if weekend shifts were available. The laundry facility paid $9 an hour, the food plant $11, the overnight cleaning job $13. She would leave the house before Thomas woke from his pain medication fog, rushing between jobs with barely time to eat, returning home after he'd drifted back to sleep. On her few hours off, she would sit beside his bed, holding his hand, reading to him from the Bible or the newspaper. But the report didn't end there. The investigator had followed the money trail. Every penny Elena earned, every single cent, was being deposited into a separate account. Richard's chest tightened as he read the account's purpose, spelled out in Elena's careful handwriting on the bank documents. Thomas's treatment fund. She had been doing this for 8 months. 8 months of backbreaking labor, of exhaustion so complete that the investigator's notes mentioned she'd been seen falling asleep on the bus between jobs, her head resting against the window as the city rolled past. She'd accumulated nearly $18,000, still nowhere near enough for the treatments Thomas needed, but she kept going. Every morning, every night, there was more. The investigator had interviewed some of Elena's co-workers. At the laundry facility, she'd picked up extra shifts whenever someone called in sick. At the food plant, she volunteered for the most unpleasant tasks, the ones that paid slightly more per hour. The night supervisor at the cleaning company described her as the most reliable worker we've ever had. Never complains, never late, works like she's on a mission. She was on a mission to save her husband. Richard's hands shook as he read the final section of the report. Elena had been going to the library on her lunch breaks, using the public computers to research Thomas's condition, printing out articles about new treatments and experimental procedures. She'd even written letters to research hospitals, asking if they had any programs for low-income patients who might qualify for reduced-cost care. All of this while Richard had suspected her of selfishness, of greed, of neglect. The folder slipped from his fingers, photographs scattering across his desk like autumn leaves. Richard buried his face in his hands, and for the first time since he'd become a man of means and reputation, he wept. Not the dignified tears of a funeral or wedding, but the wrenching sobs of someone confronting their own profound failure of judgment. He had looked at Eleanor and seen only a poor immigrant woman who'd married his father. He'd never bothered to truly know her, to understand her, to recognize the fierce and quiet love that burned in her like an eternal flame. While he'd been building his empire and patting himself on the back for offering money, she'd been sacrificing her health, her sleep, her very life to save the man she loved. Richard didn't remember driving to his father's house. He only remembered standing on the porch at 2 a.m, his fist raised to knock when the door opened. Elena stood there in her cleaning company uniform, exhaustion carved into every line of her face. For a moment they simply stared at each other. "I know," Richard said finally, his voice breaking. "Eleanor, I know everything. And I'm so sorry." Her eyes widened with something like fear. "Please," she whispered, her accent thicker in her exhaustion. "Don't tell Thomas. He cannot know. It would hurt his pride, you understand? He is a proud man. He has given so much to this life, to you, to me. I cannot let him feel he is a burden. This is my choice, my love I give to him." Richard shook his head, tears streaming freely now. "Elena, you're killing yourself. Those jobs, those hours." "Then I die loving him well," she said simply, her chin lifting with quiet dignity. "This is what love means, Richard. Not the words, not the easy times, Love is what you do when everything is hard and you do it anyway. Something shifted in Richard's chest, something fundamental and permanent. He thought of all his achievements, all his wealth, all his success. None of it, not one bit of it, came close to the nobility of this woman standing before him in her cleaning uniform. This woman he'd judged so harshly and known so little. "Let me help," he said. "Please, Elena, not just with money. Let me really help. Let me be part of this. Let me learn from you what it really means to love someone." Elena studied his face for a long moment, and perhaps she saw something there that satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, "but we do it together, and we do it with respect for your father's heart." What happened over the next few months couldn't be measured in dollars, though Richard spent plenty of those. He arranged for the best specialists to consult on his father's case, but he did it carefully, working with Elena to present it to Thomas as a clinical trial his regular doctor had recommended. He hired nurses, but they came as part of a home health program his father's insurance had supposedly approved. Every step was taken with care to preserve Thomas's dignity. But more than that, Richard showed up. He came to the house not as the successful son conferring charity, but as a student learning from a master. He sat with Elena and his father, listening to their stories, really listening for the first time. He learned about Elena's childhood in the Guatemalan highlands, about the brother she'd lost to violence, about how she'd come to America with nothing but hope and faith. He heard about how his father had been the first man to treat her not as a poor immigrant, but as a woman of worth. He was there the morning his father woke without the usual agony etched across his face. When the new treatment protocol finally began to work, he saw Thomas reach for Elena's hand and whisper, "Mi amor, you look so tired. Are you okay?" And he watched Elena smile and lie with grace. "Just happy, my love. Just so happy you are feeling better." Richard was there 3 months later when his father took his first pain-free steps in years, walking from the bedroom to the kitchen where Elena was making breakfast. He saw Thomas embrace his wife, really embrace her, holding her close and saying, "I don't know what I did to deserve you." "You loved me," Elena said simply. "You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else." Richard understood then that he'd been given a gift far more valuable than any of his businesses or investments. He'd been given the chance to witness true love, the kind that doesn't calculate or measure, that gives without counting the cost. He also finally understood that family wasn't about blood or suspicion or guarded hearts. It was about showing up, about seeing people as they truly were, about loving them not for what they could give you but for who they chose to be, when everything was hard and they did it anyway. Years later, when people would ask Richard Morrison what his greatest success had been, he never mentioned his company or his wealth. He would simply smile and say, "Learning to see the people right in front of me. That's the only success that ever really mattered."